Had to get that coffee in. Howdy, y'all. Welcome to History by Phillips. I'm Mr. Phillips, and welcome to this series. This is the second video of the series of a more perfect union. Here we're looking at pretty much the Articles of Confederation and the emergence of the U.S. Constitution. Yesterday we talked about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were terrible for several reasons, but just to keep in mind, one, they couldn't issue or print money. Two, they couldn't conduct business with foreign affairs, like dealing with Europe, Spain, some of the Latin American countries, even some African countries. They couldn't effectively negotiate with them. And another is they couldn't effectively run the military. They couldn't really force people to join or enlist. They didn't really have a way to pay soldiers yet. With all this will all come to a head. One event will highlight the problems of the Articles of Confederation. In this time period, we look at right after the American Revolution, when the Articles of Confederation were written, to the U.S. Constitution. That's what we're getting at today. The U.S. Constitution finally makes its appearance. Woo! Bang! America, baby. The U.S. Constitution is finally signed in today's lesson. We'll be going in depth with the U.S. Constitution tomorrow, breaking down what it consists of and what it's actually meant to do. But today, let's talk about the failures of the Articles of Federation, also known as the first attempt of the U.S. Constitution, the First League of Friendship. It all fell through. So let's get into it. So obviously, we won the war with Britain, the American Revolutionary War. Wars cost money, just like the French and Indian War. Britain raised taxes to help pay for it. Well, Americans got to do the same. They got to pay tax. They got to raise taxes and all that because they are in debt. They got to pay their foreign allies for the help, like France and Spain. Still got to pay some soldiers. There's a lot of folks that need to get paid and they're not getting paid. This would lead to a depression. Basically, there's no money being produced or made, and unemployment is on the rise. All unemployment means is people don't have a job; they're losing their jobs. Very common trope. I'm sure you hear that today. It's a big political talking point, especially with this presidential election about jobs and unemployment rates. Yeah, they was dealing with the same stuff back then. One group of people that affected particular was the farmers. Now, the farmers, they suffered quite a bit during the American Revolution. Both sides of the war, war causes devastation to the land. So you have soldiers marching through the fields, fighting on the fields, exploding. A lot of farms would get destroyed. Also, where we couldn't conduct foreign affairs that well, and Britain kind of cut us off from the West Indies over in India, from that trade. Nobody's making money. If you can't make money, you can't pay off your debts. And that's what we have here. We have a lot of these farmers, they can't pay off their debts, and all of a sudden you have the U.S. government coming in and taking their farms and houses. That'll happen today. Say, for instance, your guardians don't make the house payments or something. Eventually the bank and the courts will come in, foreclose on it, and take it from you. That's what was going on back then. These folks couldn't afford it. So what would happen, especially up around Pennsylvania, there would be something known as Shay's Rebellion. Although I know my board's still not the greatest. I'm working on it, children. Don't worry. But Shay's Rebellion. So who is Shay? So Daniel Shay. He was in the Continental Army, served with George Washington. He's a farmer. But he's also affected by this. Farms getting took. And these judges, he would lead about 1,200 men in Pennsylvania to these judges' houses, and he would pretty much bully them, force them to stop coming in and take people's houses. This is very reminiscent of the 1920s when people would gang up on the pretty much bill collectors, the best way to think of them. But these judges, they're going after these judges. They don't like them enforcing this rule that they're having to take property and stuff, because that's a big debate back then too. Owning property. You were somebody if you own property. If you own property, you can vote. He was kind of like the upper echelon of society if you had property. So Daniel Shay and all his buddies, they get together, and a lot of these are Continental soldiers. They're harassing these judges. They're finding them, beating them up, trying to pretty much using terrorist tactics to stop them from taking their homes. Eventually, George Washington would have to put a stop to this. But they had to rely on the militia, not the army. It was militias that had to stop them. But this was evidence enough that the Articles of Confederation was not strong enough for the government to function properly within its own borders. So the 55 delegates from the Second Continental Congress, they all get together again, and they start coming up with a new plan. Hence, that new plan will be the U.S. Constitution. We'll get to that in a second. But know that Daniel Shay's rebellion is just a bunch of angry farmers getting mad, took it out on the court system, beat up a bunch of judges. It highlights the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. We'll move on. We'll talk about slavery for a second. Slavery is going to be a hot issue for pretty much the rest of this course. So slavery. So we just fought the American Revolution for the ideas of freedom, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that jazz. But yet you still have citizens subjugating their own people to slavery. Seems kind of ironic. Seems like the pot calling the kettle black. There's still slavery going on in the United States. Typically, the further south you go, the more slaves you'll find, because slaves are typically put on these plantations and farms, and most of these farms are going to be found in the south, typically because of geographic reasons. The growing season's better in the south, better soil, blah, blah, blah. The winters are long and cold up north. It's hard to get crops growing. So typically, you find more slaves the further south you went. So up north, they kind of start outlawing, they start progressing toward banning slavery. But that's not, the common misconception is that the North was anti-slavery and the South was pro-slavery. The North may have got rid of slavery, it took them a little bit, but that doesn't mean that it's not something. I mean, it's still racist, still discrimination. African American children can't go to the same schools as the English American children. They can't vote. So on and so forth. It's still harsh treatment. But keep that in mind. Slavery's starting to go away in the North because they don't really need. You don't really need slaves to run machines or something. But on the other hand, in the South, are you going to pay for this big fancy farm machine and upkeep, or would you rather have a bunch of slaves that you really have to pay nothing for? I mean, you got to feed them and give them somewhere to sleep, and that's about it. The rest of the time they're working. It's a lot cheaper on the wallet. Anyway, anyways, it's easier to own slaves than it is to actually do it legitimately. So that's why the South would take off with slavery. It's pretty much free labor. I'm sure McDonald's and all them make millions of dollars, but imagine if they didn't have to pay their employees. They'd be making money hand over fist. That's what you have going on in the South. You have a subjugated group of citizens being forced to work against their will pretty much for free and no chance to get ahead in life. They can't. It's not like they can put money in a bank account or savings or no. They just wake up, work, go to sleep, work, and often harsh treatment, getting yelled at, ridiculed, beat, you name it. The American slavery might be some of the most brutal in recent history. Slavery has always existed, but the way Americans treat their slaves is almost like they would treat like a dog or a mule or something that you work with, like just no regard to the feelings. Very ugly. Enough of that. Let's move on to we'll be talking about slavery a lot more, especially when we get toward the Civil War. Let's get on to talking about the Constitution. So these delegates, these 55 delegates, these bigwigs get together. Now, the thing to keep in mind with these delegates, all of them are white men, typically over 30. There's a couple younger than 30. Oldest being Ben Franklin, I think he was 80 at the time. But all these men are white, is what we like to call WASP, W-A-S-P, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. All that fancy term means is they're pretty much white Protestant Christians from England. Which makes sense because we was colonized by England. Most of these folks were going to be English in nature. But that means there's no women on this council. There's no African Americans, no Native Americans. hardly anybody else. It's just these. So was this Constitution really written for everybody, or just written for the rich white folks that could vote? And remember, back then you can only vote if you own property. So there's a very limited pool of citizens you could pick from when it comes to voting. That eventually changed when Jackson comes around. Woo, Jackson. We'll talk about it. I love Jackson. You either love him or hate him. We'll talk about him here soon. But the Constitution is mostly a bunch of rich white dudes. Now, there's two plans that came together. One is you have the Virginia plan. Let me get my light turned off here. Maybe you see my board a little better. Let's see. Well, I don't know if that helped at all. Still can't see it, can you? Let's see if I can bring this over. That's not going to help. Pardon me, children. That's lighting issues. Anyway, I digress. So, there's two plans that come about. One is you have the Virginia plan, and two, you have the New Jersey plan. So, the Virginia plan, it wanted a legislature, think of Congress, they wanted these legislature based on population. So the bigger your state, population-wise, the more votes in Congress you can get. This would help out. This would favor states like Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, these high-populated areas. This would essentially give them more power in government. The New Jersey plan, however, it called for equal representation. I mean, pretty much every state gets one vote, regardless of population and size. Everybody gets one vote. This will help states like the Carolinas and Delaware, Rhode Island. They'll be able to have equal footing and a say with these bigger ones. Is that fair? Who knows? But they would come up with a compromise. It's known as the Great Compromise. It pretty much sets up the government that we have today. Particularly, it affects our Congress. Now, when I say Congress, I'm referring to two entities. First, we have the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is based on population. I forget Tennessee's, but I think we have 11 or 12 representatives. I should know this. I apologize. But for instance, states like Wyoming that don't have hardly anybody living there, they only get 3 representatives, or 1 representative. Places like California, Florida, and New York, they have like close to 30 to 50 representatives. Now you have the Senate. Now on this side, every state has 2 folks. You have 2 senators. Every state has 2 senators. So on one hand, you have pretty much the Virginia plan, the House of Representatives. Every state gets representatives based on their population. And on the other hand, you have the Senate. Every state only gets 1 or 2. Every state gets 2 representatives. This is how the votes are decided for the president, the Electoral College. If you add up the House of Representatives, Senate votes, that'll get you close to 435. You need 270 to win, but we'll digress into that later. But long story short, is they've come up with the compromise here. And it'll be pretty much how our government's still based on this today. This will be signed September 17th, 1787. I know 4th of July seems like a big deal. To me personally, this is the day that we should be celebrating. This is the day we should be blowing stuff up, lighting fireworks off. I mean, yeah, Declaration of Independence, yeah, we declare freedom from Britain, yada, yada, yada. But the U.S. Constitution is pretty much what makes us an American. This separates us from everybody else. This designates us as American. This is why we're American, because we follow these kind of principles and guidelines. With the Constitution, the first 10 amendments that would pass would be the Bill of Rights. There was a big debate on whether or not we should have a Bill of Rights or not. That would be between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But we'll get into that tomorrow a little bit. But tomorrow we'll be talking about the Constitution. what is the Constitution, the parts of it, how it's broke down. We'll look at some of the amendments. But for today's lesson, there's also a need for change. The Articles of Confederation stunk. Couldn't do anything with it. The government is a weak central government. They would get together at the Constitutional Convention, come up with a new plan. That plan will be the U.S. Constitution that we know and recognize today. The reason why, Shay's rebellion, it highlighted the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. It showed that the government couldn't pretty much control things inside its own borders because of Daniel Shay. Slavery. People start questioning slavery a lot more. I mean, we just fought a war for liberty, freedom, pursuit of happiness, all our God-given rights, but yet we still have a group of citizens in our country that are living in chains, literally living in chains. But that's it for today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the Constitution. This has been History by Phillips. I've been Mr. Phillips. Take care, be safe. Make sure you come to study block today at 1:30. Until the meantime, everybody take care, be safe. See y'all tomorrow.